The Prix Galien is a welcome initiative to stimulate creative research and promote excellence. Barack Obama. The Galien Awards ceremony is considered the equivalent of the Oscars night for the innovators in the labs and awards every year the best pharmaceutical product, the best biotechnology product, the best medical technology, best digital health, best incubator accelerator, best startup.
This is the right event, on the right issue, at the right time.
I thank His Excellency, the President, for bringing Prix Galien to Africa, and I look forward to the day when we will celebrate an African winner of the Prix Galien.
I'm particularly grateful to receive this award.
The awards are among the highest honors in science and commerce because they lead to improvement in the human condition.
The Prix Galien Awards recognize the world's brightest minds and most innovative companies. They are a true celebration of the hard work required to produce life-changing interventions.
That is what makes us optimistic about the future.
Congratulations to all of you.
Make a difference. Join the Galien Foundation.
And welcome to the Galien Foundation Week of Innovation webinars here in New York. The objective of this week is to provide additional context and background for our largest annual event, the Prix Galien USA Awards, to be held this Thursday, tomorrow, here in New York City, in conjunction with our annual Galien Forum of speakers representing top scientific experts and leaders in global health. We developed this new webinar series to give our nominees for Best Pharmaceutical, Best Biotech, Best MedTech, Best Digital Solutions, and Startup Accelerator Incubator products greater visibility in describing their journey of medical discovery. This year's Galien USA Awards has a record 147 nominees for our 6 categories, and these are coming from 126 companies covering 15 diverse therapeutic areas, ranging from cancer, cardiology and neuroscience to infectious disease and very rare genetic diseases and vaccines. We will be looking closely at the products in all of these critical areas throughout this week. Now, for today's webinar in the Best Pharmaceutical category, we will be holding a number of webinars because of the large number of products, 32 of them, representing in this important field. Today's webinar in this hour allotted right now is devoted to the nominees in rare genetic diseases. This webinar will be recorded and we will have time for some audience questions. So let's move into our discussion and introductions. I'll kick off. My name is Jessica Federer and I will be your moderator for today's session. My background is in the pharmaceutical industry. I was the Chief Digital Officer for Bayer, where I ran digital for the global pharmaceuticals, consumer care, crop science, and animal health businesses. And now I'm on the venture capital side of the business as a managing partner at Supernode Ventures, where we invest in early stage companies. I'd like to now turn to our panelists to introduce themselves. First, Dr. Colin Hislop, then Dr. Rodolfo Perini, and Dr. Pam Veig. Colin, will you start?
Thank you, Jessica. So my name is Colin Hislop, as you've heard. I serve currently as the Senior Vice President of Clinical Development at Eiger Biopharmaceuticals. I'm a pulmonary physician by training and have spent the last 30-some years in industry developing drugs across a number of different therapeutic areas. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here and share this time with you all. And I'll be speaking specifically to the development of Zokinvy or lonafarnib for the treatment of an extremely rare condition called Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome. And I'll speak more to that in a few moments, but delighted to be here. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you very much. I'm Pam Veig, Head of Research and Development and Chief Scientific Officer of Mirum Pharmaceutical. I have a background in liver stem cells and histopathology of the liver. I've been in industry for about 28 years, predominantly in adult liver diseases and now rare pediatric liver diseases. starting in hepatitis B, hepatitis C, NASH, PSC, PBC, and I'll be speaking about Alagille syndrome and progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, specifically about the drug Livmarli, which recently got approval last year for the treatment of cholestatic pruritus in children with Alagille syndrome, in which these children have really an incredible phenotype, and their cholestatic pruritus leads to liver transplantation. So very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Rodolfo.
Sure. I'm Rodolfo Perini. I'm Associate Vice President of Clinical Research at Merck. I lead the renal cell carcinoma program, as well as the belzutifan program. I'm a medical oncologist and am a nuclear medicine physician by training, and I've been in the industry now for almost 10 years.
Wonderful. Thank you all for those introductions. Now, for those watching the webinar right now, there is an accessible link on the side in the chat where you can click to learn more about the products that have been nominated in this disease class and the companies as well. So let's get into the discussion with the first question. I think it's helpful to understand more why your company chose to focus on the disease state that it did. And each of you mentioned a little bit about it already. But tell us a little bit about the therapeutic breakthrough and the unmet medical need that you are addressing. Pam, I'll start with you and then go to Colin and then Rodolfo.
Yes, thank you. So, we're really excited. So Livmarli is the first drug approved for the treatment in Alagille syndrome, and the impact that this drug has had, we feel, is incredibly significant. So firstly, children with Alagille syndrome have this really debilitating and severe cholestatic pruritus, which is driven by elevated serum bile acids. And those bile acids are toxic. It leads to disease progression. But the phenotype that these kids experience is they're literally tearing their skin to bits. They're small, they're toddlers, they're babies, they're children. And parents often describe that they wake up and there's blood on the sheets because they're scratching themselves so much they don't sleep. School is difficult, and the whole family dynamic becomes very difficult. And off-label therapies have been used until now, and refractory pruritus is an indication for liver transplant. So the metric on this is that 69% of children will go to transplant for pruritus. That is an incredible number for a very, what is a symptom. And so they can't really get at the itch because it's not dermal. So what Livmarli does, the impact that it had, is that there's a significant reduction, number one, in pruritus, a reduction in serum bile acids, which is significant. And what we've shown is that when you're able to reduce that pruritus, we have done a natural history comparison with a well-aligned and matched, what we call a control group that's receiving standard of care, and looked at that over 6 years. And in that analysis, we've shown a 70% risk reduction for events. So an event-free survival improvement on death, liver transplant, surgical diversion, as well as hepatic decompensation. So really changing the trajectory and the meaningfulness of an impact of heart outcomes on these children over time.
Wow, thank you. Colin?
So your question is in two parts, really. Why did the company get involved in this particular disease area, and how does the product represent a breakthrough therapy? So I'll attack it in those two parts. Firstly, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome has been known for about 120, 130 years. It was first identified or reported back in the late 1890s. But it wasn't until 2003 that the genetic basis of this disease was actually identified. And very quickly thereafter, with identification of the defect, the cellular and downstream consequences that result in the phenotype were very readily identified. The disease itself is a spontaneous mutation of the LMNA gene, a gene that codes for a structural pre-protein called prelamin, which undergoes intracellular processing into its final form. And lamin has a number of important roles within cellular division and cellular architecture in particular. It's important for the integrity of the nuclear envelope. It's important for organization of chromatin, particularly during the during cellular division. One of the steps in this intracellular processing pathway involves farnesylation. And because of the genetic defect, the prelamin that is coded is actually abnormal. And once it becomes farnesylated, that farnesyl group cannot be removed, and all the downstream processing doesn't occur. So we end up, or the patient ends up with this an accumulation of this abnormal protein, which doesn't have the functional characteristics of lamin, and this consequently results in abnormal nuclear architecture, abnormal cell division, which ultimately is expressed clinically in the phenotype that is well described in the literature, and particularly the accelerated form of aging, and specifically affecting the cardiovascular system, which is the major cause of morbidity and mortality. And these children would typically, untreated, die in their mid-teens. Now, Eiger is a company that is primarily focused on the development of a farnesyl transferase inhibitor that incidentally was originally developed by Schering and then Merck, called lonafarnib. Lonafarnib is a farnesyl transferase inhibitor, but Eiger actually got involved because one of the founders of the company, Jeffrey Glenn from Stanford, identified the processing of HDV to require farnesylation as well. And so Eiger was actually founded around a potential treatment for hepatitis delta virus by inhibiting this farnesyl transferase and the farnesylation of the hepatitis part of the hepatitis B virus. One could treat the hepatitis D virus infection. They are co-infections. So that was the genesis of Eiger. As part of the agreement with Merck to license lonafarnib, came a responsibility to continue to support research that was ongoing at Boston Children's Hospital. By the time the genetic defect was identified, the intracellular processing was identified and noted to involve farnesyl transferase, studies were starting up at Boston Children's Hospital. The first study began in about 2006, 2007. And so essentially Eiger, as part of its broader, if you like, license agreement with Merck for the development of lonafarnib to treat hepatitis delta virus, actually agreed to also continue to support the clinical studies that were ongoing at Boston Children's Hospital. And we've supported those studies all the way through now to almost their conclusion. There are one or two patients still continuing in observation from one of the studies, but ultimately it was the support of those studies and the data that those studies generated that allowed us ultimately to submit an NDA and as you know, ultimately in November of 2020, gain approval from the FDA. So that in a nutshell, or not really a brief nutshell, but in summary, is how Eiger came to be involved with this disease and why we're here talking to you today.
Thank you, Colin. Rodolfo.
Sure, that's a great story, Colin. I'm going to borrow some of your approach to answering the question. I think I'll start with the fact that belzutifan or Welireg has been approved for the treatment of patients with VHL disease-associated renal cell carcinoma, CNS hemangioblastoma, or pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors not requiring immediate surgery. That approval was in August of 2021, just taking a step back and thinking about the history of VHL disease and how we got to where we are. The manifestations of VHL disease were initially described in the late 1800s. And, that's when, a German ophthalmologist, von Hippel, described patients had vascular hemangioblastomas in the retina. So we've known about the disease for quite a long time. And, it wasn't until the 60s that the disease was actually called out as von Hippel-Lindau. Lindau was a Swedish pathologist that in some of those same patients as, von Hippel, identified the retinal hemangioblastomas. The pathologist later identified that they had visceral disease. So what happened in patients with VHL disease is that they have a germline mutation in the VHL gene. And what that leads to is those patients develop benign and malignant tumors that are vascular tumors. Those are multifocal, they're recurrent, and they affect multiple organs. So they can affect the pancreas, the kidney, the central nervous system, and so on and so forth. There were no treatment, options for those patients other than frequent scans and surgery or radiation. So these patients were living in a cycle of surgery, recovering from surgery, thinking about the next surgery. And in terms of understanding the disease and shifting to belzutifan, the disease was known in the late 1900s. We learned about the underlying genetic abnormality in the late 90s, early 2000s. Later on, it was identified how the VHL gene leading to abnormal VHL protein, leading to accumulation of HIF2 alpha and the downstream activities of that, accumulation of HIF2 alpha. So, and it wasn't until the structure of HIF2 alpha as a protein was identified and a pocket was found within HIF2 alpha that molecules were designed to fit that pocket and then block the dimerization of HIF2 alpha with HIF1 beta and then blocking the downstream activity. So, it is in a way a classic story of science that you build upon what others have built before you, and then you move things 1 inch forward at a time, with the goal of leading to a drug that will make a big impact in patients. So, going back to how Merck got involved or why Merck got involved, I think it starts with, the unmet need that I outlined, the opportunity to make an impact on those patients with such a high unmet need, and, cutting edge science, being part of a first-in-class HIF2 alpha inhibitor, or not only that, but it's the first drug that's able to successfully target a transcription factor. I think those things were opportunities that, once presented to us, we had to jump on it. So that's in short, the unmet need and how Merck got involved.
Thank you. So now the second question is going to go into a little bit more of the clinician and patient response. So I want to ask about the clinical outcomes for the patients that you're seeing with the product, and then also what response you're seeing from doctors and patients and families in this space. Actually, Colin, can you start for us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I mentioned in my previous remarks, progeria, as it's sort of commonly known by its abbreviated name, is an aggressive disease. It's a relentlessly progressive disease, manifests very shortly after birth, and is certainly identified more often than not within the first 12 months, typically due to a recognition of a failure to thrive of the infant. But there are also other physical phenotypic features that are somewhat characteristic of the disease. But above all, patients have an accelerated form of atherosclerosis, which is the principal cause of morbidity and mortality. And as I referenced a few moments ago, untreated, the average lifespan of these children is around 14 and a half years, and that hasn't changed over the decades. What's somewhat unique about their cardiovascular disease is that it is not a dyslipidemic disease. So drugs like statins have had no impact on morbidity and mortality, really. Neither have anticoagulants or aspirin, for example. And if you examine the cardiovascular system of these children, at the age of 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age, their cardiovascular system is representative of somebody in their 60s or 70s in the general population. Most importantly, because of the accumulation of progerin in the vasculature, there is an intense inflammatory response. There is a loss of the vascular smooth muscle cells. The large vessels in particular become very fibrotic, very sclerotic, very rigid, and as a consequence, the vascular compliance declines. These children develop hypertension, and in some instances, because of the thickening of the vessels, there may be actually total occlusion that can lead to TIAs or strokes very early on in the child's life. And what the team led by first Mark Kiernan and then Leslie Gordon and Monica Kleiman at Boston Children's were able to show is that over a period of several years, when treated with lonafarnib, the vascular compliance in these children actually tends to improve. Their pulse wave velocity goes down, and perhaps more importantly, they have a lower propensity to develop hypertension. Hypertension and hypertensive heart disease being one of the principal causes of morbidity and mortality. And what we found over the course of the two studies that were conducted at Boston Children's, when we put all the data together, was that there was an improvement in survival. And at the last time we looked at the data, which would have been, I think, August of last year, the mean increase in survival had gone up to about 4.5 years. And indeed, if you look now at the population in general, that's only an average. If you look now at the population in general, you see them increasing in age, obviously on an individual basis, such that some of the older patients in the world now are well into their 20s. They're leading very successful lives. I mean, this is a devastating disease, but it does not carry any cognitive dysfunction. So within the restrictions of the disease itself, these children and young adults are able to lead age-appropriate lives. And with this increasing longevity associated with lonafarnib treatment, they're now moving into higher education. And indeed, one of the oldest surviving patients that we know of in the world has completed one master's degree and is about to embark on a second master's. So in summary, what we believe is happening with lonafarnib or Zokinvy as a treatment here is that we're actually addressing the underlying biology, in particular, the cardiovascular biology that is driving morbidity and mortality. And with long-term treatment, we're actually increasing survival. And as I mentioned, the average increase in survival now is about 4.5 years. And we're still going with the follow-up. We're out to 9-10 years or more of follow-up now. And I would expect that increase in survival to continue to creep up. So rather than patients that are faced with no treatment and maybe a lifespan limited to about 14.5 years of age, they're now living well into their late teens and early 20s.
Wow, incredible. Rodolfo, can you share with us?
So yes, we've seen quite a great impact on those patients. Not only the ones that were part of the clinical trial, but we've also heard from patients who have received belzutifan as part of the standard of care. And what we've seen over time is that those patients have had high response rates in all their disease sites. So as I mentioned, patients with VHL disease, they have multifocal, multi-organ involvement with benign and vascular tumors. So what we've seen, patients with responses in kidney, pancreas, and central nervous system. And just, and as time has gone by, when we first looked at the data and submitted for regulatory approval, the response rate in kidney cancer was 36%. And at this latest presentation, the response rate has gone up to 63%. And we've seen the same pattern in central nervous system hemangioblastomas. We've seen the same pattern in pancreatic and endocrine tumors, to the point that now we're seeing more and more CRs, or complete responses on those patients. The other thing also that has been, it's a secondary endpoint of the study, but we were very fortunate to observe, is the fact that those patients have retinal hemangioblastomas, so benign vascular tumors in the eye, but they're classified as benign just by virtue of the fact that they don't spread elsewhere, but they carry a lot of morbidity, and they can lead to vision loss. What we've seen is that 100% of patients had responses on those retinal hemangioblastomas, and it was quite remarkable. Some of those actually, lesions going away, and so it is quite remarkable to see that. We've also conducted a natural history study looking at patients that were treated per standard of care and what happened to them, before belzutifan was available, and we saw great number of surgeries and a lot of morbidity associated with those surgeries. So, we've seen a great response from patients. If you look in social media, there's one of the patients on our trial that posts a lot about his experience, which is fun to watch, and he's been traveling the world and living his life. So that's great to get to understand this. We've also been in very close contact with the patient organization, the VHL Alliance, which has been great, and they've shared with us insights from patients and how their lives have been impacted, and that has translated into what we hear from clinicians. I've had the opportunity to meet Dr. Bill Galien, who won the Nobel Prize along with Dr. Semenza and Dr. Radcliffe, for his work in the HIF pathway, and also work closely with Dr. Linehan at the NCI, who was among the folks who identified the VHL gene. When they first saw the data, they both said, they've been waiting for this for their entire lives. And, it was quite humbling to hear that from them. And again, it speaks to how the breakthrough that this drug represents for those patients with VHL disease.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo. Dr. Pam.
Yeah, thank you. So I feel like I hit the punchline in the last question. So maybe let me back up for a second. I talked about impact before. So let me just maybe level set a little bit of foundation on Alagille syndrome. It's driven by genetic mutation in the Notch2 jagged 1 signaling pathway. And these children have an assortment. It's really a multi-system disease. Some of them can have a significant cardiac involvement. They have vascular involvement. Most of them, though, will suffer from liver involvement, and cholestasis is there from birth. And it is the cholestatic liver disease that really is driving the majority of what they will suffer from. And so what happens is early on in life, they'll present themselves for being very, very ill before the age of 2, and by age 2.8 years of age, a lot of them will go to transplant. If they don't, there will be then a slower disease progression, but they will progress, where then by age 18, there's only 41% of kids that have native liver survival. So the majority of them will go to transplant. And that was sort of the natural history course that I was speaking to before, which shows that of those that go to transplant, about 69% of them go to transplant for cholestatic pruritus and other manifestations associated with these really exorbitant, elevated serum bile acid levels. And those levels, I'm sorry, my dog is barking, and those levels are elevated to sometimes greater than 300 micromoles per liter, keeping in mind that 8.5 is what is normal. So these elevations in serum bile acids are very, very high. Now, what happens as a result is, number one, as I spoke to, the pruritus. That is incredibly significant, and I can't really overstate what that's like. It isn't an itch as if you are, have poison ivy or a dermal itch. It really is the horrors of what you can imagine and what is described by the patients and the physicians. And we're very close to the patient advocacy group, the Alagille Syndrome Alliance, spending a lot of time with these families. And what they describe is very humbling and quite difficult to hear sometimes. And the caregiver burden is extreme. The cycling through of off-label drugs includes rifampicin. They always give UDCA and cholestyramine often, antihistamines, mostly to keep like a sedative to help these kids sleep at night, but they really don't sleep at night. Parents don't sleep at night. Often parents can't work because of that, because of the visits. So what invariably happens also as a result is that because the bile acid circulation, bile acids get stuck in the hepatocytes, and so there's a bile acid retention as a result of these this problem with the liver. It's like a plumbing issue where there's a paucity of bile ducts as a result of this genetic disease. So bile cannot get from the hepatocytes out into the intestine. And for you and I, and a normal bile acid circulation, 95% of our bile acids are circulated, and we use them to digest and to solubilize and to absorb fat-soluble vitamins and lipids. And because of that, these children are often very, very small, and they have failure to thrive. They're below the threshold of their Z-scores, and they don't grow. So with Livmarli, which is an IBAT inhibitor, this drug, what it does is it interrupts the enterohepatic circulation. And what I mean by that is it stops bile acids from recirculating back to the liver, and so they then are excreted through the colon, thereby reducing the levels of bile acids in the hepatocytes and systemically. And then by reducing that bile acid load, you start to see improvements in several things. So first off, the first outcome you see is that improvement in pruritus. Serum bile acid is a surrogate for that, but you see these significant improvements in pruritus. Kids mutilate their skin. You see that skin start to clear. The second thing is they start to sleep, which is incredibly important. We've seen a couple of kids get taken off the transplant waiting list. Xanthomas, which is a lipid deposits due to these incredible elevations of cholesterol that these kids have. Lipid deposits, these xanthomas start to disappear because of the mechanism of action of Livmarli by reducing bile acids. You have cholesterol breakdown, and because of that, the xanthomas start to disappear. Xanthomas can be quite debilitating and interfering on a daily basis. One very important thing that we have also seen is that we have seen growth acceleration in these children. And a couple of theories on that. One is that there may be better bile acid homeostasis. The other is that the fact that these kids are now sleeping, there may be nocturnal growth hormones at play that allow them to grow. And so we're digging into that a little bit. And I think the most impactful, as I mentioned before, is that we see a 70% improvement for event-free survival, and that these kids are not going to transplant. So potentially delaying or obviating the need for a liver transplant. And just being the first drug ever to be approved for Alagille syndrome, where until now there really has been nothing except for a transplant surgery, I think has been really game changing for families, patients, and the physicians. So we're just really excited about the overall impact this has had on the quality of life of these kids.
Absolutely. Thank you for all three of you for sharing about the incredible unmet medical need that your companies are addressing. The third question for us to address is a little bit more of an insight into your drug development process of moving from an early proof of concept into your human trials to market authorization. And the question is designed with the background of what lessons are there that might add to a better public understanding of the innovation process that your company went through and the challenges that you face to bring this new innovation to market. And for this one, Rodolfo, I'll ask you to start.
Sure. Thanks. I often paraphrase to my team that movie, The Martian, and that what we do is solve one problem and the other and the other and the other. And at the end, if we solve enough problems, we're able to get to a drug approval. And I think the story of belzutifan is in large part has quite a lot of analogies to that. I say, I think one of the challenges initially was the fact that the first drug wasn't belzutifan. The first drug was called MK3795 or PT2835. So that drug established the proof of concept that inhibiting HIF2 alpha with a small molecule could lead to clinical activity. What happened with that drug is that it had such a variable pharmacokinetic profile, meaning that in a small group of patients, you could have very high concentrations, very low concentrations. So that didn't allow that drug to move forward. So belzutifan was one of the earlier compounds, and that had to be brought into development. So that's one of the challenges. I think, we can have a whole chapter on manufacturing challenges. I think, not being someone that is part of the manufacturing sciences, but have a great appreciation for what they do. I think conducting a small phase 2 trial during the COVID pandemic, I think that was, another challenge that we faced. And then, going from the early part to sort of the closer to the market authorization, I think, again, conducting the trial during the pandemic, undergoing an FDA inspection during the pandemic, and working very closely with the FDA and other regulators on how do we define the benefit, how do you quantify what this medication can mean to patients. So I think all those things, and again, being a first in class, being the fact that it's a first inhibitor of a transcription factor, I think the FDA had all the right questions, and thankfully the team worked hard to answer to those things. And then in terms of lessons to bring better awareness to the public, I think it's unlike The Martian. Drug development is a team sport. It's more so than anything else. Not just within our teams, but the teams of scientists that came before us, right? And as I mentioned, that going from describing VHL disease in the late 1800s all the way to Nobel Prize in the understanding of the underpinning of the HIF pathway by Galien, Simmons, and Ratcliffe, to then identifying the pocket, identifying molecules that could bind to that pocket, enrolling into a trial, managing the side effects. It's a lengthy project. It's a lengthy process. with, and a lot of folks who started developing the science into that, they didn't foresee that a drug could eventually get there. So I think that's, in a way, it's not a relay race. We're not racing versus each other. I call it more of a group marathon, right? You recruit other scientists to run with you. And we're all running towards, improving human lives. In this case, patients with VHL disease, but hopefully our goal is to bring belzutifan to other diseases in which the HIF pathway is relevant, such as renal cell carcinoma.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is a marathon. Thank you, Rodolfo. Dr. Pam.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's one step at a time. I agree with Rodolfo on that. You have to really, there's a lot of patience involved. There's a lot of creativity involved. There's a lot of, pivoting, I think, sometimes. So in the case of LIVMARLI, this drug originally, was for an anti-hypercholesterolemia compound way back originally, because the mechanism of action of interrupting the enterohepatic circulation is that you would lower cholesterol, and in a quite not an elegant way. And then statins came along, and of course it was shelved. And so I think that speaks to innovation, because the side effect of that as a hypercholesterolemia drug is that it lowered serum bile acids. And so how remarkable is that you take that side effect, and I think this is what's so incredible about drug development and discovery, is that you take that side effect and you say, hey, what diseases require a lowering of bile acids? And there's a whole host of cholestatic liver diseases. And so, that was started by, Mike Gray and company at Lumina. And that's really the origination of when IBAT inhibitors started in cholestatic liver diseases. And the studies began in Alagille syndrome there at Lumina. It then was handed over to Shire, and the studies continued to roll along. And then when Miram began, we sort of took it back with Mike Gray, who is one of the co-founders of Miram as well, understanding that he knew these drugs work. Now, it's a slow race, because in an area where there's never been an approved drug, endpoints in the beginning are murky, effect size is unknown. These are not big diseases, so it really takes a group of people to live it, breathe it, know it, understand it. You're really like living in that space, and it's what you think about. And in rare diseases, I think you need champions. That's all you think about all day. And Miram was really born out of this drug, out of LIVMARLI, which is maralixibat, where that is all we did was dig through the data. And when we acquired the compound, we had a pretty rich data set that came with it of 4 years of information. And that 4-year data set in a rare disease is sort of unheard of. And so with that data package, we went to the FDA on the basis of what is the ICONIC study. And over the time, these 3 studies, the dose was increased. Mm-hmm. And we thought, aha, there's the dose, there's the treatment effect. We can see a difference. And it was as clear as day. And we went to the FDA with data in hand on the basis of this phase 2 study. And we said, there's a significant unmet need. We have 4 years of data, and we want to talk about this. We worked hand in hand with the regulators, and they were terrific, actually, in parsing out what was important, what is the benefit risk, the safety profile, what is the treatment effect. And I am, now we've got 7 years of data. And so it is our job, I think, as drug developers to not just stop once you get the drug approved. I think that's really, really important, especially in rare diseases. You don't stop when the drug is approved. It is our job to continue to dig in and move the field forward. And so with that, we continue to analyze our data set. We ask questions, we dig deep, we pull on that thread, and because we have this longitudinal data set and patients come in frequently for their visits, real world is very different. And you can only get that granularity of data from clinical research databases. And so we're really quite proud, I would say, that the team we have is terrific on asking those questions, very specific questions. And I'll give you an example. And I was talking about growth. And so we thought, who are those kids that are growing? And we looked at those patients in quartiles and thought, and the way that we looked at them is the patients who came in with the worst disease score, so those who had were the lowest on that growth chart, had the biggest improvement in growth. So that's fascinating to me. What's happening there? Why is that? What's happening with the pool of the serum bile acid subspecies? And then we need to dig into that a little bit more. And those little bits of information and those questions that get answered, we work with the key opinion leaders, we work with the physicians, we work with the scientists, we work with the advocacy groups, and we keep pushing the field forward. Because if we don't do it, it's really, it's not going to happen, because these are rare diseases. So that is I'll stop there, because I think that is a big piece of the innovation and the obligation that we have as drug developers.
Thank you, Pam. Dr. Colin Hislop.
Well, I think I'm going to echo what my fellow panelists have said in many regards. I mean, lonafarnib, Zokinvy, was another example of a drug that had been developed, originally starting life in oncology as a potential therapy for solid tumors, ultimately didn't pass the test and was shelved. And then, as I described, the discovery of the genetic defect, the requirement for farnesylation was made known, and all of a sudden the drug has a new lease on life, so to speak. So it's just another example of finding an alternative use for a therapeutic that may otherwise have been consigned to the waste heap. Now, having said that, in terms of the issues with respect to development, Zokinvy didn't follow the classic pathway of preclinical development, proof of concept, and then a definitive or confirmatory study. Because of the nature of this disease and the rarity of the disease, at the time when the studies were conducted at Boston Children's Hospital, there were probably some 60 odd children involved, and they represented, I would say, perhaps 2/3 of the estimated population worldwide. That number may now be of the order of 400, but this disease has a incidence of about 1 in 4 million live births. It's extraordinarily rare. So there wasn't, a typical pathway as you might imagine. And once the genetic pathway was identified, the role of farnesylation was identified. The next most logical step was to embark on a clinical study. And the importance of that can't be missed, because, as I said, this is a relentlessly progressive disease. And the earlier the intervention, the less likely the disease is to progress. So needless to say, as many children as possible were offered the opportunity to participate in the clinical studies that began around 2006, 2007. And that led to ultimately a signal that suggested there was an increase in survival. And it was at that point, really, that we got most heavily involved, and we took those data, along with the cardiovascular data and the other data that I mentioned, to the agencies, both here and in Europe, and discussed, the approach that we might take to get a licensure. The issue, though, is where is your comparison? And the natural history cohorts was mentioned by Rodolfo. There was, fortunately, a natural history cohort. But it's not always straightforward because being such a rare disease, these children come from about 26 different countries they were coming to Boston Children's Hospital from. And so, when matching up against a natural history cohort, historically, it's not just age and gender, perhaps, that you're thinking about, but it's standards of care, all the sorts of things that can influence and potentially bias any form of comparison. But having said that, ultimately, we were able to navigate both the questions that FDA posed and the interrogation that we received from the European Medicines Agency, and were successful in obtaining approvals from both. So I wouldn't say that there are tremendous lessons to be learned per se, other than, as Pam was speaking to as well, the need for persistence and a constant, to quote Rodolfo, solve one problem after another, and ultimately, if you solve enough problems, you do indeed end up with a licensed product. And in terms of public awareness, I will say that the Progeria Research Foundation here in the US and the Family Circle in Europe do a tremendous amount of work in terms of engaging the public, providing support for families, resources for families that have children affected by the disease, but also the broader landscape of engaging the public awareness. The Research Foundation has an annual event where they showcase the latest research and share information to a very broad audience. And I think that it's engagement with and support for those types of organization in this particular disease that is probably the most impactful and most beneficial. As I said, it's extremely rare and doesn't hit the news as often as some of the more commonly found chronic diseases. But those sorts of activities, I think, are extremely important, extremely impactful, and we've been privileged to be engaged in them. Engage with the foundation and the Family Circle and provide support as well.
Wonderful. So now we're coming to time, but I just want to have a quick round of last thoughts. Pam, then Rodolfo and Colin, and then we'll bring it to a close. Pam, what are just some last closing thoughts you have for our audience?
So closing thoughts are that, I have a lot of thoughts. It depends on whether we're talking about Alagille or the future or innovation of the future. I think if we're talking about product specific and where we're headed as a company, we at Mirum for Livmarli, we just unveiled a phase 3 study that, again, rare disease and progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis with the same drug, and really a laborious study to enroll because it's very rare diseases, genetic subtypes of 93 patients, and that just showed positive results. So again, marching bit by bit to finally get to the end of that study. And really excited to have positive results on that. And that was just announced earlier this week. So that's kind of the future of this drug again. And then we're looking at other cholestatic liver diseases. And I think that the, transplant-free survival when you lower serum bile acids has been shown in already in some indications. And I think that that's something to really look out for, because that's not been normally measured in clinical practice. And I find that fascinating for cholestatic disease, that serum bile acids are not always measured. And I think that with IBAT inhibitors coming on board as hopefully standard of care, being the only drugs approved right now for Alagille syndrome, and there's also another one for PFIC, that will become standard of care. And I think that that's really important to be able to change standard of care. And I will leave with the parting thought of, I think drug development, it changes standard of care. And I think what we're trying to do ultimately at the end of the day, as we march forward bit by bit, is to change that standard of care. Ultimately, that's the end goal for families and for physicians.
Thank you. Dr. Rodolfo.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, first I want to thank the Galien Foundation for highlighting the importance of science and innovation, and congratulate my fellow panelists. I mean, it's only through science and innovation that will improve lives of patients. So I think that's a very important thing. The other thing also is that, I hope that in the future we can cross more targets from the list of undruggables. So HIF2 alpha has been successfully crossed out. And I think, from the future perspective, I want, I hope that we can, as a group, as a community of drug developers, inspire more people to go into science and inspire more people to pursue the avenues we're pursuing. Because, a discovery that is done in the lab will really impact people if it becomes a drug that eventually can be delivered to patients. So I think that's where we live. We live on that bridge of taking something that is a discovery in a lab, making it to something that will impact people's lives, and hopefully we can recruit more people to join us in this marathon.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Collin.
Yeah, I'll keep this brief. There's been some quite exciting work done with genetic interventions, both in vitro and in an animal model, that show, a lot of promise for the treatment of HGPS. But the translation to the clinic is a long and arduous journey, and fraught with a lot of difficulties, and has an extended time horizon, I think, although the optimism is there. And in the interim, I think we must just continue to support these patients with Zokinvy. It is the only drug that is approved. It's the only drug that has been demonstrated to reduce mortality or increase longevity. But for me, the exciting future really probably must reside with some of these genetic and gene editing techniques that hold a lot of promise. But as I say, it's a very long pathway, and the horizon is quite some way off.
Thank you. And with that, it is my pleasure to thank you on behalf of the Galien Foundation, not only for joining us today, but for your tenacity and your perseverance and your dedication to creating the future and changing the world. Changing the landscape for each of the patients' lives that you're touching and their families. So the webcast from today will be live on the website, and we look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow at the Thursday's Jubilee Forum, which begins bright and early at 7:30 a.m. And then we will have the afternoon presentations of awards and the awards dinner event in the evening at the American Museum of Natural History. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your work in innovating in these very important high impact areas. Bye-bye.
Thank you.